Good morning, everybody, and welcome to another teachingamericanhistory.org Saturday webinar sponsored by the Ashbrook Center at Ashland University. TAH.org is the leading online resource for the documents-based study of American history, government, and civics for teachers, students, and citizens. My name is Chris Burkett. I teach here at Ashland University, and I'm also co-director of our Ashbrook Scholar Program for undergraduate students here. So the theme of this year's webinar series is Great American Debates. And if you happen to be joining us for the first time, I'll just mention that the purpose of these webinars is to pull together some thoughtful scholars, discuss some interesting topics and documents, and give you all a chance to jump into that conversation by submitting questions in the chat box. So if you submit a question in the chat feature, I ask that you make sure you send it to all participants. That way everybody can have a chance to look at those questions, and our panelists today can also see questions that are submitted and can feel free to answer those questions as they see fit. I'll also mention that in the next week you'll receive an email with a link to request a certificate of participation, and that email will also include a link to the archived video and audio from today's program. Excuse me. So today we're discussing imperialists versus non-interventionists, and I'm very happy to be joined by two very thoughtful scholars today. Greg Schneider of Emporia State University. Sorry, Greg, for joining us. And again, I'm really grateful for you being here. I understand you're under the weather a little bit, but really appreciate you toughing it out to be here. And Jason Stevens, my colleague here at Ashland University as well. So thanks again to both of you for being here. So.
Happy to be here. Thanks, Chris.
Good. You sound good, Jason. All right. Excellent. We're all set. Sorry about the confusion. So I love this topic personally because this seems like one of those rare moments, not to say it's the only moment, but it's a kind of rare moment in U.S. history when a foreign policy event or issue leads to this really important and great public and political debate over not just foreign policy, but the meaning of the Constitution and even the meaning of the Declaration of Independence. So this is, of course, Woodrow Wilson wrote famously that nothing changed us more as a constitutional people than the Spanish-American War and its aftermath. And I think hopefully we'll pursue that today and see whether that's true or not. But I'm going to start with a broad question for Greg and Jason. So that we're talking about imperialists versus non-interventionists today. So maybe two broad questions to start with. And as always, my standard disclaimer is you're free to ignore any question I throw out and talk about anything you want to talk about that's interesting. But the imperialists, I'm wondering, did they think of themselves as imperialists? And if so, what might in their minds distinguish their imperialism from, say, the more common versions of European imperialism that's taking place at the time? In other words, did they see themselves as imperialists with a distinction? And then sort of on the flip side of the coin, the non-interventionists. I wonder, first of all, if it's fair to say non-interventionists and anti-imperialists, are those the same people, or are they two separate sorts of two separate sorts of people? But non-interventionists, anti-imperialists, they have this. They have the. I'm not trying to think of the right word. It's not a stigma, but they have anti or non in their name. So are they simply against something, or can we say that anti-imperialists or non-interventionists stand for something? In other words, is there non-interventionism or anti-imperialism rooted in a more positive, if you will, understanding of what the role of the United States in the world should be? So I thought we'd start with some broad questions, if either of you would like to start with that. If not, take it away in any direction you like. Greg, do you want to start? Do you mind?
Yeah, I'll start. I think clearly when you look at somebody like Teddy Roosevelt's Beveridge, certainly in this essay, which is famous for his defense of the Filipino conquest, Alfred Thayer Mahan and other kind of ardent imperialists of the late 19th century, there was this conception of, I'm not sure if Teddy Roosevelt wanted to assume that he'd be as great or America would be as great a power as Great Britain, but he was certainly moving in that direction with the two ocean navy he was proposing, and certainly the Great White Fleet, a string of bases through the Pacific for which Americans can engage in the China trade, which was the key to our imperialist ventures, as Beveridge even says in his essay on the Philippines. So I think in some respects, I always see this as what the Americans are competing against as much as anything is the rise of Japan and the rise of Germany, and the fact that all three nations are really have-not nations. If you think about it, in the late 19th century, Germany had just become a nation. In the 1870s, Japan, under the Meiji Restoration, a recently empowered, centralized economic powerhouse in the Pacific. And that's who the competition is, I think, for a lot of the imperialists. Not so much Great Britain, but those two nations, the have-not nations who don't have colonies and everything else. Now, what's interesting, of course, is the Americans are always interested in getting colonies, it seems, but then they don't know what to do with them. And this has been the case all throughout our history, right? I mean, think about, we're good at going into countries and freeing them from something, but then what? Afghanistan's a good example of that. Iraq to some degree in recent years. I mean, we have this tendency to want to help peoples defend themselves from something, but then we're not the greatest colonizers, imperialists, the way the British and the French are. In fact, Americans don't seem willing to go live there at all in the same way that the British, and to bring civilization. So we talk about it, we talk a big game, but don't deliver it. I can come back after Jason to my view of the non-interventionists, but I'll let him chime in on this.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think that's very well said. Right, it's always good that we define our terms up front. So, Chris, I really like this question. Who are we talking about when we refer to imperialists? Who are we talking about when we refer to non-interventionists? And I like Greg's example of Theodore Roosevelt. Roosevelt, and I was just able to pull this up. Roosevelt, he writes in a 1904 letter. He says this about referring to those who are in favor of expanding into the Philippines as imperialist. Roosevelt wrote, quote, "The simple truth is that there is nothing even remotely resembling imperialism involved in the present development of that policy of expansion, which has been part of the history of America from the day she became a nation. The word means absolutely nothing as applied to our present policy in the Philippines. Much of that campaign, indeed, was a positive appeal to make us a world power through expansion, not imperialism," end quote. So for Roosevelt, he's not an imperialist. He doesn't see himself or understand himself as an imperialist. He was an expansionist. And what the difference is between those two things, well, it's a little hard to tell. I'm not even sure if TR in his own mind clearly understood that difference. But the point is that most imperialists did not latch onto that word. They preferred expansionist, manifest destiny, and the same thing is true for the non-interventionists. They actually, right, were called by the imperialists. They were called isolationist, as the non-interventionists would refer to Theodore Roosevelt and McKinley and Beveridge and others as imperialist. I think it's inaccurate to refer to the non-interventionist as so-called isolationists, because certainly they were not against intervention everywhere under every circumstance. But the reasons for intervening abroad, that is where you find a key difference between these two camps.
If you really think about Jason's point there about expansion, if you really think about the Western expansion in the United States, maybe the only real true imperialist war in U.S. history was the Mexican War, which was about conquering territory, taking territory from the Mexican government, and acquiring this great expanse of the Southwest and California. I mean, that to some extent rings clearly as an imperialist conquest.
Absolutely. I mean, in that same letter that I quoted from TR, he tries to link his policy of expansionism, as he calls it, back to the country's history. He goes on to talk about Jefferson's acquisition of Louisiana, Jackson's exploits against the Seminoles, and the American victories in the Mexican War.
Mm-hmm.
TR says we're doing the same thing in the Philippines that we've always done in our past. This is really nothing different.
So I have several follow-up questions from the points both of you have made. So, but on this point, then are imperialists like Beveridge then are they just old-fashioned manifest destineers, or is there something new added to this equation that might distinguish what Beveridge, in particular, insofar as he represents an imperialist view, thinks that the United States is doing as abroad that would distinguish it from what we were doing in Mexico with the war with Mexico?
I think for Beveridge, you see a couple of things. You see the philosophy of the open door best expressed here in his speech, because the point about the Philippines and acquiring them is the way station on the road to China. So China is the ultimate goal, which is why McKinley wanted the Philippines in the first place, which is why the Americans put such a stock on the Philippine trade, or to acquire them from Spain, as the ultimate goal, really, of the Spanish-American War, because of the lure of the China trade. And coming out of the 1890s recession, depression of that decade, this was very imperative and very much focused around what later Secretary of State William Hay would call the open door, the opening of trade to China and the end of this kind of imperial preferences that the Europeans had established. China's being gobbled up. If the U.S. doesn't get in the race, they'll lose out. So that's a big part of what I think Beveridge is talking about, which again isn't really imperialism, except when he talks about the fact that we have to rule or administer these inferior peoples. That's a different kind of mentality than, let's say, what Jason quoted TR saying in 1904, because this very much assumes that America will have an administrative role, a ruling role over the Philippines, which I think is a different thing entirely from what TR is saying later.
Yeah, and that's a great point, Greg. I think that's exactly right. And not only in regard to what is America's role after the war is over in these places, right, as far as administering or governing these other peoples without their consent. The other key difference, I think, from earlier events in the nation's history had to do with the reasons for going to war in the first place. Whereas in the past, the justification had largely rested um, on protecting American rights and interests. By the end of the 19th century and the war with Spain, all of a sudden the justification for starting the war, for engaging in the war in the first place, turns from, okay, what is best for America, to what is best for America and the particular peoples involved.
Mm. So there's a more altruistic aspect to it,
Yeah,
or almost benevolent aspect to what we're doing.
absolutely.
It may
So
be
never justified in the non-interventionist argument, because the non-interventionists or the anti-imperialists, since there was an anti-imperialist league that was formed with Carnegie and Mark Twain and others, Jane Addams, who were part of this kind of group during the Filipino War. That's what they call themselves. Later, they would be lumped together as isolationists. But you have their perspective is very much based on the founding principles. They're true believers in the principles upon which America was founded, and any deviation from those means you're making that transit from republic to an empire. And as soon as you become an empire, you lose basically what makes us unique as a nation. You lose the exceptionalism upon which America was founded. That very much rings clear in Van Dyke's sermon, which is the first time I've read this, and is fascinating. And if you look at other non-interventionist arguments, including, interesting, William Graham Sumner, the great social Darwinist, who basically argued that if America will become like Spain if we conquer Spain. In other words, we'll turn into a monarchy, and a corrupt, decadent monarchy as well. I mean, that's the really interesting arguments you see in these essays around the turn of the 20th century. Not so much, I think, in anti-war movement discussions today. It's all about, so let's go back to the 60s anti-war movement in Vietnam. It's all about what we're doing to the Vietnamese people. We're immorally fighting this war, which is true and no doubt about it. And same thing in the Iraq anti-war movement, the same kind of arguments. It's not about American ideals. It's about what we're doing to the peoples we're bombing and making war against.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, and I really would like to at some point get into how this affects the way we think about those principles and those ideas in more detail, especially in the arguments regarding the Declaration and the Constitution. We've got a number of really good questions coming in already based on what both of you have said. So our old friend John Talley, hi John, asked a couple of good questions. First, a clarification on my statement that there was the benevolent aspect. John asked, benevolent or belief that American culture is superior to all? And another question John submitted, was Beveridge really a progressive, or did he simply share Teddy Roosevelt's policy and expansion? I think that's a great question too. And I might twist that question a little bit to say, or to ask more broadly, what is it about being a progressive that tends to make one an imperialist?
Yeah, those are two really good questions. And I mean, you bring in the progressives, that's sort of, I mean, that's subject to the same rule that we were talking about when it comes to defining who are the imperialists and who are the non-interventionists. What does it mean to be a progressive? Right? Is there anybody who would, step forward and loudly shout, "No, I'm not a progressive. I'm an anti-progressive, or I'm a reactionary, or something like this." I think that the policy of imperialism or expansionism, whatever you call it, is linked in a very fundamental way with the basic theory and tenets of early American progressivism as it was understood by those early progressives like Beveridge, like William McKinley, like many others. And the reason for that has to do with the first question, I think, Chris, that you asked about, American benevolence, or the belief that American culture is superior to others. One thing that united all progressives was the belief that there were enlightened races, superior races, and that there were other barbarian nations of the world, and that it was the moral responsibility of the superior nations to help out, specifically to uplift those barbarian nations. And Beveridge talks about that explicitly in that March of the Flag speech, that we're going into the Philippines, we're taking on this duty, we're fulfilling our destiny, in part to help out these other races. It was, I mean, the sincere belief of the progressives who turned to imperialism, that we were actually there to help out these other these poor Filipinos. I mean, Beveridge talks about them as children. They're sort of in a childlike state, and the American parent needs to go in order to help see them into adulthood. William McKinley said, "It's my unshaken belief that America has a moral responsibility, a moral duty to go into the Philippines and help them develop as a people and rise up through the hierarchy of the nations to make them better morally, politically, socially, intellectually."
Yeah, I've always thought this might be one kind of distinction, possibly, between this new sort of progressive way of thinking about expansion and the reasons for expansion and the earlier views of manifest destiny. It's this racial component that's added, right?
Yeah.
Because the United States, I think from the Beveridge's perspective, is one of these historically advanced nations because, well, it's a largely Teutonic or Anglo-Saxon nation, right?
Yeah.
And this related to some points Greg was making earlier about the need to keep up with European colonization. I got the sense sometimes that on the part of some progressives like Beveridge and others, there really is a kind of sense that, hey, the United States is one of these historically advanced Anglo-Saxon Teutonic nations as well. So if the European peoples are doing it, and they're sort of on the cutting edge of history or historical development, that for the United States not to do it as well would kind of be like shirking our duties that have been assigned to us by some understanding of historical development. This is getting really abstract, and I apologize, but I always wondered if that might not be one distinction between this way of thinking of expansion and the earlier manifest destinies. Although I think you do find some of that in some of the earlier arguments, but
Yeah, you're right, and that's a great point because I mean, if we look at like Stephen A. Douglas, right, as an earlier proponent of the early manifest destiny that you're talking about, you don't see in his arguments in favor of expansionism into Central and South America the same arguments that you see from Beveridge or McKinley or even TR that we're going to go in there and help these people. For Douglas, it was no, we're going to go in there for additional slave populations and expanded territory, and Douglas never really answered the question of, okay, what are we going to do with all of these peoples?
yeah, I mean that's a huge.
Well,
I think
think
that's
of what the progressives allow at home too, on the issue of the race question. So you have the kind of institutionalization of separate but equal in the 1890s, of segregation, and the progressive movement and progressive politicians are somewhat silent on this, believing that in many respects the solution, well, even though problematic in terms of the growth of equality, the solution is actually one which is better than forcing an issue head on about whether or not the black race is equal to the white race. And so you have this even at home playing out at the same time. And then think about the historical profession in the late 19th and early 20th century. I mean, this is the reassertion of the idea that the South was wronged following the Civil War, and the whole Dunning School of historiography about Reconstruction, which is dominant in the early 20th century. I mean, all of this is built on this kind of scientific racism, the supremacy of one types of civilizations, the Teutonic races over the other, the germ theory of development from German forests and the like that was very popular at the time. I mean, I think this plays a role in kind of progressive thinking about race and about the supremacy of American civilization. There's no doubt about it.
Yeah, and here's where it gets complicated. That's a great point, Greg. And again, there are a number of other questions I'd love to get to, but on this point, two things strike me. One, I'm always fascinated that it's the Republicans that tend to be the imperialists, right? And by this point, perhaps that's because of the end of slavery. The Democratic Party, or especially the Democrats of the South, are no longer inclined toward the expansionism. At least that's my impression. It's a largely, correct me if I'm wrong, Greg, but my sense is it's predominantly Republicans who happen to be both progressive and inclined toward imperialism.
I would say yes to that, though. Remember, the Spanish-American War was the war that helped probably bring an end to sectional division, because Southerners are very enthralled by the war and join up in large numbers. So this was the first time, in some respects, after the Civil War, that you had unity on a question of policy due to the war against Spain. So that kind of binds the nation's wounds. I mean, William Jennings Bryan, remember, joins the military during the Spanish-American War and then becomes an ardent anti-imperialist after it. But he's buried at Arlington because of that service, which is quite interesting, and then becomes, due to the Filipino War, which is really, I think, the changing part. It's not so much, the war against Cuba and the war against Spain and Cuba. It's the Filipino War that's really the break for a lot of the anti-imperialists, because that goes too far.
Yeah.
For them.
No, that's again another great point. It reminds me of a point you made earlier, Greg. I think about European nations or new European nations expanding their colonization abroad seems to coincide with rising nationalist movements in Europe. And perhaps in light of this thing, I mean, the end of the Civil War combined with this unity over the cause of the Spanish-American War, we actually may be thinking about ourselves as a nation, a real nation for the first sense. And so it doesn't seem coincidental in a way that we also at this point think, well, we're a nation, and so nations colonize, or nations have imperial policies. But yeah, that's a great point. Thanks for clarifying on that. I had a number of other interesting. Oh, by the way, that was my thought on that just came in response to one of the first questions that John Hazlitt submitted. Hey, John, about he noticed in the Van Dyke sermon that the term United States seems to be used to denote a nation, a whole, as opposed to the sort of pre-Civil War way in which that phrase was used to denote, 40-some separate states,
Hmm.
loosely connected in a federation or a federal system. So, um, can I ask a sort of technical question really quick that somebody asked about? I do want to get into the importance of the Philippines and maybe a little bit about Cuba as well. But just really quickly, uh, what about Puerto Rico and Guam? Why is there so little debate about Puerto Rico and Guam? Seems like most of the debate centers around the Philippines and then Cuba.
You know.
Well,
Anybody?
the Philippines we decide to take as a colony within what, a year's time after the end of the war there, and that pits Emilio Aguinaldo, the resistance leader, in resistance to us, and begins this Philippine insurrection, which lasts 3 years. Cuba, we never decide to take as a colony, but we write a constitution which basically binds Cuba to us because we can intervene in Cuba internal affairs. Puerto Rico and Guam just become territories, and this is as natural as, let's say, Midway Island becoming a territory back in the 1860s. I mean, it's not thought of as any negative way. It's a part and parcel of what the interventionists or the imperialists have been arguing about, the necessity for coaling stations on the road to China, et cetera. So there wouldn't have been any issue with that at the same time. What they find when Americans return from the Cuban War, especially, is that, if you look at the salesmanship for Cuba, it had always been made in the fact that we were going to free the Cubans from Spanish control and the evil Spanish. Well, the Spanish were European, and a lot of the Cubans we find are mixed race and black. And for Southern troops, especially, this is very problematic that we're going to free these people and govern themselves when, blacks in the American South are living under the beginnings of segregation. So we find that maybe we were on the wrong side in some respects. At least there's some issues there with regard to this, which is why we want to at least bind the U.S. towards the Cuban polity as much as possible, do the right to intervene. Philippines is a much more difficult issue because we face an insurrection by Aguinaldo against American forces, which is brutal and probably very much along the lines of later ones we'd face in the Pacific War and World War II and in Vietnam.
Yeah. No, those are great points. And again, Jason, I've read what you've written on McKinley and his Greg calls it the salesmanship for Cuba, right?
Yeah.
And McKinley does, if I understand him correct, if I remember correctly, justify his call for intervention on the grounds that the ultimate goal is self-government for Cuba. Am I wrong about that, or is that Congress? Congress, I think, wants to make sure that it's very clear that if we intervene in Cuba, it's not for the purposes of permanent occupation, but for the ultimate liberation.
Yeah, that belief is expressed through the Teller Amendment.
Teller
right?
Amendment. That's right.
Right. That if we're going to intervene, right, we are not going to make Cuba a colony of the United States, as opposed to the Philippines. And Greg brought this out. McKinley really struggled over the Philippines on what to do with the Philippines. Do we get out completely? McKinley thinks, well, no, if we do that, they'll just be gobbled up by another European power. Maybe Spain will come back in again, or some other empire will come in and lay claim to them if we don't. Maybe we just annex the largest and most commercially and militarily profitable island, Luzon. Maybe we just take Luzon, as maybe we take Guam as and set up military outposts there, right, to protect American interests. Well, no, we can't just do that. Because that leaves the poor Filipinos and the rest of the islands sort of again likely to be subject to other empires. And so McKinley, after facing as he described it, a prayerful night, he stays up all night praying. The next morning, decided we're going to annex the whole thing. We're going to annex the whole thing, and it's going to be an American colony. And again, that is very different than the American response in Puerto Rico or Cuba or Guam or anywhere else, because right, Puerto Rico and Cuba, there's some proximity to the United States there. Maybe some people are thinking, well, maybe Puerto Rico can eventually become a new American state. Nobody believes that the Philippines are going to be entered into the American Union as a new state. When it comes to Guam, yeah, it's very far away, but you know what? That could be very profitable, right, for the United States when it comes to commercial ties with other nations and our military. The Philippines was altogether different, right? Because it's far away, and it doesn't really have a strategic military or commercial value to the United States, especially considering the rebellions and uprisings that are going on there, and the vast amount of treasure and blood that America has to spend long after the Spanish-American War is over, and just continuing to hold the Philippines.
Yeah. Yeah. So again, very interesting. So this sort of opens the constitutional question, or a central constitutional question that I've seen debated in or seen in the debates in Congress over, especially what to do with the Philippines. And that has to do with the question as to the Constitution clearly implies and therefore gives, I say this carefully, the United States the right to acquire territory, but there seemed to be disagreement among members of Congress about this time as to what the justifiable constitutional grounds for the acquisition of territory are, right? So
Yeah.
one of the requirements, as you mentioned, seemed to be territory can be acquired as long as the ultimate purpose is to make that territory and the people that live in that territory a permanent and full member of the United States, right? So, um, uh, so it's clear to me now. Puerto Rico, because of its proximity, you might be able to make that argument and say, well, we can acquire Puerto Rico because it's close and it's possible that someday they could actually become a state.
Yeah.
Um, although, again, I also recall reading people who disagreed with that because they argued, well, yeah, but we don't ever foresee the people living in Puerto Rico as being capable of being full American citizens. So there's that racial aspect again.
Mhm.
Guam, it seems to be, and again, I'm throwing out what I think I've read on this. I'd love for both of you to correct me if I'm wrong. Guam, it's as though the constitutional question is buried because the argument is it really is because of its strategic location,
Yeah.
of a military and economic necessity that we just take Guam as a territory.
Yeah.
Cuba, we talked a little bit about the complications with Cuba, right? So we're not going to we're not going to acquire Cuba as a territory, but as Greg pointed out, through the Platt Amendment, we'll be able to govern them effectively for their good and our good. But the Philippines really seems to be the sticky constitutional question, because if it's not a vital strategic necessity to have the Philippines as a territory, and there's no way that we plan to ever make the Philippines part of the United States permanently, what arguments are left for doing what we're doing?
Yeah, here's what Van Dyke says about this, and just like Greg, I found Van Dyke's sermon here really interesting. This is what he says about the constitutional question, the issue that you raised, Chris. This is page 73, about in the middle of that page. It is contrary to the Constitution of the United States as interpreted by the Supreme Court. That is, right, going into the Philippines and making them a colony. The authority of that magnificent tribunal, in which the Anglo-Saxon ideal of the supremacy of law is forever embodied more clearly and powerfully than in any other human institution, is clearly against the legitimacy of a policy of a colonial expansion for this republic as now constituted. There is certainly no power given by the Constitution to the federal government to establish or maintain colonies bordering on the United States or at a distance, to be ruled and governed at its own pleasure. No power is given to acquire a territory to be held and governed permanently in that character. So for Van Dyke, his understanding of the Constitution is that that document does not give the federal government the power to go into any place, close or far, and rule the peoples there absolutely without their consent as a colony.
Yeah, on a permanent basis.
On
Yeah.
a permanent basis, right? Exactly.
So temporary basis, perhaps, but then, if the goal is to rule them only temporarily, then it seems like you're left with one of two arguments to justify that temporary governance and administration. And one is the military or economic necessity argument, and the other is the sort of benevolence argument. It's good for
Yeah,
it's good.
that first argument, right, we got from the American founders, and that had always been sort of part of the American tradition. That second argument that you bring up, Chris, that we're doing it for the good of the specific peoples involved, that is what is completely new in the progressive era.
Okay.
And I think too that this is where, if you flash forward 30 years to the arguments that Van Dyke is making, to how the non-interventionists in the 30s argued about the threat of Hitler and the necessity to stay out of another terrible European war, because remember, after World War I, Americans were very opposed to intervene in Europe again. For what? For what purpose? We didn't remake the world the way Wilson wanted, and nothing changed. And so why get in? And again, they were making the same kind of constitutional arguments in the 30s, all the way up until World War II. They were making these same arguments that you hear from Van Dyke, principled arguments about what the Constitution allows, about what the nature of American power should be in the world, the republic versus the empire thesis, etc. And because that became, I think, such an unpopular position with the wake of the America First movement, that position really dissipates throughout American history after that time. So we look back on these people now and perhaps read that era into their thinking and say these people were just perfectionists. What they wanted was to prevent America from becoming a greater country and putting us, terrific limits on what American power should do in the world. So it's easier for the imperialists to break that argument because they can argue that, oh no, we're being forced to do this. If we don't do it, other countries will. If we don't do it, we're not going to be a great power. All of these things that justify our expansion. And that becomes the central debate really through 20th century foreign policy, at least up until World War II.
No, that's
back again, I guess, in the wake of the Trump election, certainly.
No, that's fascinating. So kind of on this point, Greg, somebody asked earlier, Shaylin asked earlier about the term non-interventionist, and you mentioned the non-interventionists of the 30s. But again, that term isolationist gets thrown around a lot, right? To characterize a certain kind of is the term non-interventionist actually the right term?
Yeah, I like that term better, and here's why. So isolationist implies that America wants nothing to do with the rest of the world. So it's a term, and in my classes I've taught America Between the Wars for MAG and elsewhere. We've talked about this a lot because in the 20s, the U.S. isn't part of the League of Nations, of course, we don't join, but the Republican governments of the 20s, Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover, are pretty actively involved in the world. And they're fulfilling a lot of Wilson's goals for arms control agreements and trade and other things without being hamstrung by, the League of Nations. So, but the textbooks, of course, call this the age. Isolationism starts right after World War I and continues until the 30s. It's really the Great Depression that kind of brings about the isolationist attitudes, the hardening of those. Because if you have 25% unemployment here, who gives a damn what's happening in Germany or Czechoslovakia or elsewhere? Those are far away and not our interest. And so I think that isolationist attitude, which develops much more in a hard way in the decade of the 30s. But I like non-interventionists as a whole. Isolationists maybe between 35 and 40.
Yeah.
Yeah, Greg, you correct me if I'm wrong because you know more about this than I do. But the non-interventionists of the late 19th century and the early 20th century, those that we're talking about here now in regards to the Philippines, they didn't refer to themselves as isolationists, right? That was a label that was thrown at them, that was attached to them by the expansionists or the imperialists.
Wasn't attached. I don't know if it was attached to them then, though, or it was just something labeled later. Because I don't remember that label really. You don't really see the label, but I could be wrong about this because I don't know enough about whether or not that label was used before then until after World War I, when the isolationist attitude is propagated by people like William Borah, who is the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee of the U.S., who is a non-interventionist, but he's not an isolationist. He wants to have relations, but on our terms. That's what he wants.
Yeah.
It's a lot different than saying, I don't want anything to do with the world.
Right.
And its problems.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, so non-interventionists They're non-interventionists in the sense that they don't want to get involved in affairs that don't directly concern the interests of the United States.
Right.
It's not that they're totally against any intervention, generally speaking.
Right. Right.
Am I
They're
right?
especially suspicious of Europe. I mean, obviously, because that had been the tradition. I mean, think of the tradition of American foreign policy, which really ends with the Spanish-American War to a degree, and with the Panama Canal and everything else. It's that whole tradition of, America will not involve itself in European affairs. Well, here we are, Teddy Roosevelt solving a peace treaty between Russia and Japan. We're building a two-ocean fleet to contest the British, I guess. We're building a canal in order to move that fleet around easily. I mean, we're becoming more and more of a great power, which is, again, natural, I think, to where the U.S. was. We were a great power economically, so it would be foolish for us just to stay in one place and not expect that there would be great power consequences with that. The need to reach markets abroad, the need to get territories to assure trade, and other things that the Americans were pushing.
But Greg, doesn't that lead to and I think I've read in other things this point raised in the debates, don't those kinds of actions and interventions abroad, and including in Europe, potentially undermine any legitimate claims the United States has to enforce the Monroe Doctrine, so-called?
Well, we have. Can you repeat that, Chris?
Yeah, I'm not sure. The question is half-baked. I apologize, but there were some people, I think, arguing that the more interventionist abroad we were outside of the Western Hemisphere, we potentially pulled the rug out from underneath, the idea of the Monroe Doctrine, which I think around the turn of the century came to mean something different than when it was initially described in a speech. The idea had come to mean Europe stays out of business, affairs in the Western Hemisphere, and in exchange, the United States refrains from intervening in European affairs.
No, it's basically just a warning in 1823 that the Europeans should stay out of the Western Hemisphere. There's no alternative there, that we're going to stay out of their affairs.
Yeah.
The one who keeps it for us is the British Navy, which has every interest in making sure the Germans and all those other countries don't take territories in Latin America.
That's
So,
right.
so if it weren't for the British Navy and our good relations with Great Britain after the War of 1812, obviously, and a few decades after that, enforcing the Monroe Doctrine for us, we couldn't have done it. I mean, there was no way. We didn't have the naval power to do it. TR, of course, changed the Roosevelt corollary to that we reserve the right to intervene in Latin American affairs. That's the shift. And that comes in, 1902, I think, when he puts that on there. Basically, then you have 30 years or more of interventions in Latin American affairs, sending of troops down. Even Calvin Coolidge sends troops to Nicaragua in the 20s after removing them, sends them back. I mean, you have all of these interventions that occur as a result of America asserting its control, the Yankee imperialist control over Latin America and Central America.
Yeah.
But no, it never stipulates that we won't involve ourselves in Europe. We don't want to be involved in Europe because it's a hellhole and it's corrupt and it's filled with monarchs and all the people we despise. And that had been the tradition, and still was the tradition, governing American foreign policy from Washington's farewell address up until World War I. And even Wilson can't change that very fundamentally, because the hard-headed Americans believe in it totally, that this is the best way. Stay out of Europe.
Yeah. Oh, those are great points. Great points. Yeah. Again, it just reminds me the 1823 State of the Union, or annual message to Congress, I guess, right, from Monroe, is where he basically just says, look, to Europe, generally don't try to expand your influence. But your point about the British enforcing the Monroe Doctrine in the Western Hemisphere is really important, because, again, I hadn't thought about it this way. The idea that what Monroe said in 1823 is a doctrine, I think that itself is a new idea that emerges. Am I not right around the time of the Spanish-American War? That what Monroe said in 1823 is sort of, they blow the dust off of it and turn it into a doctrine that may, and then, of course, as you're pointing out, Roosevelt reinterprets that to authorize the United States to be very interventionist in the Western Hemisphere. But that also seems to be a reflection of this changing mindset about the role of the United States in the world, including in the Western Hemisphere and outside of the Western Hemisphere.
We also want stability in the region for our economic rationale. I mean, if anything, it's the what some scholars have called the Coca-Colanization of American foreign policy, right? That we want markets for goods, we want markets for American firms, we want to control commodity markets in Central America. So Guggenheim mining in Central America, the Dole banana and Dole sugar and pineapples in Hawaii, et cetera. All of these sorts of things are what a lot of Republican policymakers are in favor of getting in the early 20th century when it comes to our foreign policy in these regions, what Taft would call dollar diplomacy.
Great point. Great point. Well, it seems like we've got a number of other great questions that have been submitted, and a number of them have to do with, again, the debates, especially with regard to the Philippines, that have to do with sort of the reinterpretation of the language of the Constitution and the language of the Declaration of Independence. And I remember reading Beveridge for the first time a number of years ago and just being shocked at the kinds of arguments he was making in terms of his interpretation of the Declaration of Independence and its meaning in 1900 or so. So, what do you make of his arguments about the Declaration of Independence? Either of you want to?
I'll jump in there. Just maybe we could start with the text and go from there. So, Beveridge, I mean, he has a lot to say about the Declaration of Independence, but really, I think the heart of it gets going here when the sentence that begins with the Declaration of Independence does not forbid us to do our part in regeneration of the world. If it did, the Declaration would be wrong. The Declaration has no application to the present situation. It was written by self-governing men for self-governing men. And then the next paragraph, the Declaration applies only to people capable of self-government. The Declaration does not contemplate that all government must have the consent of the governed. So what you see here is really a fundamental reinterpretation of what the Declaration of Independence actually means. Beveridge, like many other progressives and like other slave apologists of the early 19th century, they take the principle of equality out of the Declaration of Independence, right? Because you can't justify ruling other foreign peoples without their consent if you hold on to that principle of equality. So they jettison the principle of equality and they reinterpret the idea of the consent of the governed and self-government. The Declaration of Independence was only written for self-governing races, those more enlightened, those Teutonic, Anglo-Saxon races, and has no application to the present peoples involved in the Philippines, to the Filipinos or any other inferior races, so-called. The Declaration of Independence should not keep us out of the Philippines. And TR was well known for this. He would literally lash out at anyone who would make this Declaration of Independence inspired argument as a justification to keep us out of the Philippines or to get us out of the Philippines. TR would lash out and say, look, you're being cowards. You're being like those copperheads back during the Civil War, right, who were afraid to undertake a manly destiny. And right, we've got to go in there, whether the Declaration of Independence says we can or can't. Who cares? This is, well, as Beveridge puts it, right, the march of God in the world.
Mm-hmm. I can't put it any better than that. I think that's exactly the point. That I'm reminded Wilson wrote an essay in, I think it was in 1908, about the Declaration of Independence and how it doesn't fit the current time, which seemed to be a very strong progressive theme. In other words, we need much more of a centralized government to deal with some of the issues, and the Declaration holds us back from that by its pursuit of equality. So, I mean, this was a consistent progressive theme. Beveridge puts it best in his articulation of foreign policy here.
So, yeah, I think are you referring to the author and signers of the Declaration?
Yes,
speech,
yeah.
Right, yeah. Yeah, so the Declaration and the Constitution, by the way, both for Wilson, have to be reinterpreted in our present circumstances, right? So every generation, given its circumstances, can reinterpret sort of the broad outlines of the document.
Right, the living document.
So at the time of the American founding, when they wrote this, they may have believed that all men are created equal, and that meant all men, all human beings. and they're endowed with equal liberty. But we now know in 1900 that, first of all, times have changed, circumstances are changed. We're not in our little shell that we were in back at the time of the American founding. The requirements of our day, the needs of our day have changed, because we are now, again, a world power. And
Right.
so again, it seems as though the fact that we're a world power with world responsibilities means we must reinterpret the way we think about that. So,
And because we Americans have all of this experience in self-government, right? We are the best equipped among the peoples of the world to go out into, right, the rest of the globe and try to help and uplift other peoples to become capable of self-government. But until they're actually at that level of being able to rule themselves and rule themselves well, the Declaration simply doesn't apply to them.
doesn't apply. So
Yeah.
when the Declaration said all men are created equal, and they're endowed with unalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, it doesn't mean equal doesn't mean equal as they understood it back then, right?
Right.
We're endowed with, it's almost as though equal liberty means you get a people gets the degree of liberty that they are capable of enjoying responsibly, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, and
Oh,
maybe just to go back to the Beveridge speech. I mean, this racial theory, this idea of a hierarchy of races is is absolutely fundamental to justifying American progressive imperialism. So Beveridge says, Mr. President, this question is deeper than any question of party politics, right? So going back to your point, Chris, yeah, a lot of your early progressives were Republicans, but it goes deeper than that, he says. It's deeper than party politics, deeper than any question of the isolated policy of our country, deeper even than any question of constitutional power. It is elemental. It is racial. God has not been preparing the English-speaking and Teutonic peoples for 1,000 years for nothing but vain and idle self-contemplation and self-admiration. No, he has made us the master organizers of the world to establish system where chaos reigns. He has given us the spirit of progress to overwhelm the forces of reaction throughout the earth. He has made us adepts in government that we may administer government among savage and senile peoples. Were it not for such a force as this, the world would relapse into barbarism and night. Right? We are saving the world. We are literally going out. We are saving the world by doing this. And of all our race, he has marked the American people as his chosen nation to finally lead in the regeneration of the world. This is the divine mission of America, and it holds for us all the profit, all the glory, all the happiness possible to man. We are trustees of the world's progress, guardians of its righteous peace. The judgment of the master is upon us. Ye have been faithful over a few things. I will make you ruler over many things.
so I can, that's amazing. I can see in a certain sense, I'm not saying I agree with it, but trying to get into that mindset, if you can dislodge the words of the Declaration of Independence out of that particular context of 1776, you could make the argument that these advanced progressive races, the Anglo-Saxon races or Teutonic races, the superior races, they are moving to fulfill the ideas of the Declaration by by first of all recognizing that not all peoples in the world deserve equal liberty, but helping them advance, to rise, right? To
Yeah.
civilize them in a certain sense. And in that sense, making them free or liberating them somehow and making it possible for them eventually down the road to enjoy equal liberty with the more advanced races of the world.
Yeah, I think that's right. The only thing I would add is that reinterpretation or new application of the Declaration of Independence that we get from the progressives is fundamentally opposed to the founders' understanding of the Declaration.
Yeah, right.
Right. So the founders say, right, all men are by nature created equal in their rights. There is a natural liberty that all human beings, regardless of place, time, or circumstance, possess just by the fact that they're a human being.
Yeah.
Any idea of natural equality or natural liberty is jettisoned here by the progressives, and that's true for their theory as a whole, which inform not just their foreign policy but their domestic policies as well.
Sure.
This
Yeah,
is
but
not
again,
something that's just that we're just finding out now, or we're just finding out here in terms of foreign policy.
and this reminds me again of the essay by Wilson that Greg mentioned earlier. The progressive response to that, including Beveridge, might be to what you just pointed out, Jason, was, yeah, we'll acknowledge that the way we're interpreting equality and liberty is fundamentally different from the way the founders thought about it. But they were thinking about it in a specific time and in a specific political context.
Hmm.
We're preserving the general ideas that they thought were sacred, right? Equality and liberty,
Mhm.
and applying them in a way that is more applicable to our present time and circumstances.
Yeah,
So we're not
absolutely.
we're not we're not being totally unfaithful to the founding. We're just recognizing we're agreeing with them that equality and liberty are important, but
Hmm.
we're reinterpreting the sort of just application of those things in light of what we know today in 1900
Hmm.
about the superiority and inferiority of different races or cultures, right?
Yeah. And the progressives aren't the first ones to do this. I mean, and they many of them will come out explicitly and say, "Hey, we're getting this from John C. Calhoun, who understood
Yeah,
liberty in the same way."
yeah. Yeah, but it's interesting. I was thinking this is why I was asked. Part of the reason I asked earlier or pointed out earlier how amazing it is that these are Republicans primarily who are making this argument. This seems more like the argument of Stephen Douglas in a certain way,
Hmm.
right? Who interpreted the Declaration to be applicable only to people
Certain
of
civilized
Anglo-Saxon or
people.
British descent,
Mhm.
right? And so it seems like there's a connection both to Calhoun and Douglas in the way they're interpreting this. But there's the other irony in this is that these are Republicans who also claim to be the heirs to Abraham Lincoln.
Yeah, so McKinley says, look, we need to go into the Philippines, and we're going to be doing the exact same thing there in the Philippines that Lincoln did for the slaves during the Civil War. We're
Yeah,
going to go out and we're going to free these peoples from right that yoke of oppressive Spanish tyranny, and we'll replace that yoke of oppressive Spanish tyranny with a slightly less burdensome golden American yoke. Is what we'll do, which
You
is
could go back
very
and say it
different
was,
from what Lincoln.
it was William Seward's tremendous goals for American expansion. What, and I think in the 1860s after Lincoln's death, where he had a map showcasing what America should expand to and encompass half the world.
oh, I didn't know
At
this.
some
Really?
point, I mean, that's the kind of the model for American expansion. A couple decades later, certainly in the
Wow.
Republican Party. So it might not be Lincoln so much; it's Seward. And the continuation of that with people like John Hay, who was Lincoln's aide, and others. And
Yeah, I mean, yes, Stephen Douglas, who Chris mentioned before, Greg, he has the same idea in
yeah,
the 1850s that Seward has in the 1860s, that America's not just going to expand east and west across the continent, but also north and south, Canada, Central America, South America.
mhm.
Douglas envisions that's going to be the start of this brand new American empire.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's amazing. I did not know that actually about Seward. I mean, it makes sense given acquisition of Alaska and other places. But
That was just the beginning.
that was the beginning. Yeah. So, what can you just tell me? Tell me. I actually did not know this. So, did he really think this was accomplishable? I mean, really, he believed
He
this?
believed he believed that this should be what would develop. That we would have interests far stretching well into Asia and other places of the world. That this was something that was as much America's destiny as Americans thought about the West as their
Wow.
destiny.
But he didn't make the argument. Probably, I assume about. He didn't make sort of the racial argument, or did he? Do you know?
That I'm not sure about.
Yeah, I would be really surprised if he did. But
Yeah.
it's still amazing. I did not know that. So there was an expansionist tendency within the Republicans. That's interesting. I actually didn't know that. That's amazing. So, by the way, the way you're both describing what we're going to do for these peoples and especially the Philippines sounds really great. I mean, it's the United States coming in. We're going to extend the hand of friendship and help these people rise up from barbarity and learn how to be free and self-governing. But what really happened? You want to tell, Craig? I know you've written on this. The, the the Philippine War is brutal, right?
Yeah, it's a guerrilla war. Eventually, about what is it, 250,000 American troops would be serving in various aspects of it, a lot of them state National Guard units. And it's brutal on both sides. There's atrocities by Americans against Filipinos. 4,000 Americans die, mostly of disease, but several 100,000 Filipinos die, it's thought, in the suppression of Aguinaldo's revolts, which takes 2.5 years. And I mean, it's guerrilla war on the jungle kind of warfare that we would fight later in Vietnam and in the Pacific Islands against the Japanese. And as brutal and kind of ugly and racist as those conflicts were as well, pitting Americans against those other peoples during those wars. So, I mean, there's a certain kind of strong consistency to the American suppression of the Philippines, the way there would be of American suppression of other revolts in the post-World War II era.
Yeah. And I believe that the United States engaged in the practice of concentration camps in the Philippines, which was something we complained about, I believe, on the part of the Spanish in Cuba. Now, again, I know concentration camps has a different meaning than it's not what we associate necessarily with the Nazis, but my understanding was that a lot of people died in those camps as a lack of clean water. And
yeah, we tried to separate anybody who was suspected of harboring the rebels would be placed in the camps, families and other things too, certainly.
Well, the reason I mentioned that or asked about it is because again, I know it's war, but we're going to help these people be free. And I guess the price to be paid for their ultimate freedom is that a lot of people are going to have to die for it. So, again,
and maybe just to jump in here for a second, Chris, combined with that, not just are a lot of people going to have to die as part of the war to uplift these so-called inferior races, but there are some members among those inferior races who are so backwards, who are so intractably inferior that they cannot be reformed.
Yeah.
And therefore they may be swept away.
Yeah. Charles Merriam, for example, I know you're familiar with, says that very thing, a very well-known progressive political scientist at the time. But see, now this is also part of the arguments I know coming from anti-imperialists, certain anti-imperialists or non-interventionists, but probably anti-imperialists, is that you're going to be involving the United States and the Philippines trying to civilize a people, by the way, that doesn't even exist, really, right? I mean, there's no such thing really as a Filipino people, except for sort of administrative convenience, I believe, at this time. What you have are thousands of different peoples on all of these islands living in their own cultures and tribes. So the idea that we're going to somehow civilize all of these people that are part of this thing known as the Philippines is, in the minds of a lot of people, is just going to be impossible.
In the minds of a lot of people, but a lot of people, especially the ones sort of formulating our policy in the Philippines, are very confident about America's role in the Philippines and being successful in this endeavor. So, like I said, McKinley, right? He always said it was his unshaken belief that we can reform these Filipinos. TR, when he comes into the presidency in 1901, he continues McKinley's policies and he continues McKinley's confidence regarding American success. Now, as TR's presidency goes on, that success, that confidence begins to wane. He begins to see the effects of what Greg described for us as the effects of that guerrilla war. TR sort of maybe begins to change his mind in that regard, but McKinley certainly was always confident that at the end of the day, right, America will succeed in the Philippines.
I guess that's part of that progressive confidence, and that that the future is wide open.
Yeah, absolutely.
For the advanced races and peoples to accomplish things that
look at beverage, right? This is our destiny, right? God has ordained this, right? Therefore, nothing can get in the way.
But what's interesting is that, TR is no doubt a social Darwinist, and when it comes to great nations and weaker nations, America is going to be one of the great nations, and so has to justify itself by throwing its weight around and taking care of or defeating weaker nations who stand in its way. But the social Darwinists, like Sumner, were opposed to intervention on grounds that pretty strongly racial grounds, that the peoples we're conquering have no business being inculcated into American life, and that we have no business in telling these people how to live and do what they have done for centuries, because culturally they're so distinct from us. And so what's interesting is that a lot of the groups of the non-interventionists or the anti-imperialists were people who would have been opposed to the justification, or that would have perhaps supported the justification of TR's applying to it, of social Darwinism, but were opposed to intervention and imperialism.
Oh, that's
Yeah,
fascinating.
that's a great point. That's a great point. And it sort of goes back again to some of the difficulty in determining, okay, who's an imperialist, who's a non-interventionist, what do those terms even mean? Right, I think of the example of one prominent Republican, the leader of the House of Representatives, the Speaker of the House. I think his name was Reed. Right, a very prominent old school Republican who was a stringent non-interventionist, and he resigns in protest in regards to what the other progressive Republicans are attempting to do in the Philippines.
Yeah, amazing. Well, we're coming close to the end of our time here, and there were a couple of questions that wanted us to think about sort of tying, this moment of imperialism in U.S. history to later foreign policy thinking. So, a couple of sort of tie-up questions here, or wrapping up questions, perhaps. How long did the American flirtation, in both of your opinions, how long did the American flirtation, I'll call it, with imperialism persist? And where do you see the influences of this way of thinking, if any, in American foreign policy after, including, let's say, World War II? I know, Greg, you mentioned a few places earlier, but maybe you can elaborate on whether we see this kind of imperialist thinking in later foreign policy events. But
And I would say certainly that the type of imperialism under discussion here doesn't last much longer than TR's administration. That Taft pursues the dollar diplomacy, which is much more investment oriented. Woodrow Wilson certainly intervenes in the Mexican Revolution to protect American interests, which is, you can see as imperialists. I don't. You see it as a justification of protecting American interests in the revolution there. World War I changes everything. The Americans still intervene in the Latin American world all the way through the 30s until we have stable dictators in power, certainly in those periods of time. After World War II, it becomes much different because after the development of the containment doctrine for handling the Soviet Union, then our interventions based on justifications of preventing the spread of communism, which can be seen, certainly as justifiable to protect nations from being taken over by communism. So it depends on what side of the question you are with regards to certainly Vietnam, because certainly the anti-war movement saw it as an imperialist war on the part of the Americans intervening to stop a legitimate social revolution, and the non-anti-war supporters of the war saw it as justifiable to prevent South Vietnam from falling to communism. And I don't think, I was trained by a lot of diplomatic historians who are on both sides of the question. So, sometimes I'm conflicted, other times I'm not. Certainly, we continue to throw our weight around Latin America in a way that would be considered very imperialist in the post-World War II period. But that region we stipulated 150 years earlier was ours in terms of our ability to govern and promote stability. The Latin Americans don't like it, and they don't see it that way either. So,
I think I'm sorry, Chris, go ahead.
No, go ahead, please, Jason.
No, I was just going to add to that I think that, right, many aspects of, right, what we've been calling progressive imperialism today, many of those aspects have fallen away, right? So, for example, right, the racist elements of this theory, that has certainly fallen away. But if you go back to McKinley's war message to Congress, right, and making the case to intervene in the Philippines in the first place. Right, as we mentioned, right, he justifies it in part for preserving American rights and interests, but also in large part for protecting other foreign oppressed peoples.
Mm-hmm.
That way of thinking about American foreign policy and America's role in the world stays with us through the 20th century and even today into the 21st century. And the result is that, right, even today, we Americans, we remain somewhat confused in regards to, what justifies American intervention abroad. Do we intervene to preserve our own rights and interests, or is that somehow selfish? Ought we to intervene to help out other foreign oppressed peoples, right? Peoples that really have nothing to do with us, but because of what America stands for and represents, we need to go out and help make the world free. Um,
Yeah.
right. So I think Americans, in some regards, still remain confused about a just and lasting foreign policy and what actually would justify American intervention abroad. This idea of we go out to help other peoples, right? This altruistic idea that starts with McKinley. That is still very much with us, and that
Yeah.
was a wholly new thing in the late 1890s.
Yeah, that's very. So again, the inclination to be more interventionist certainly persists from this, but as you say, Jason, the racial aspects of it, or the idea that there are inferior and superior races, and that there's some sort of moral obligation on the part of the superior races,
Yeah.
yeah, that language goes by seems pretty quickly. But I wonder sometimes if we don't sort of bury that idea or couch that idea in democratic terms. That is, when we say we're democratizing undemocratic people, if there's not implied in there, I mean, some element of this idea without being explicit with regard to racial inferiority and superiority. But it seems
Right.
like that's the
Right.
that's the new mode by which we combine sort of self-interest and altruism or benevolence in foreign policy. So, I'm
Mhm.
thinking of, Kuwait, the Gulf War, right, with Iraq, and the justification that the first President Bush gave was, well, the United States has interest in the region, but maybe more importantly, we're going to liberate the people of Kuwait from Saddam Hussein and his tyrannical regime, and so on and so forth. So it seems like we've managed to combine, even during the Cold War, Greg, it seems to me, and almost every major Cold War speech by a president justifying significant U.S. action or policy, we tend to combine uh, sort of self-interested or national security interests in our motives with a desire to help others in the process. So, and I'm not saying that's necessarily a bad thing. That just seems to be the mode that we're in. So,
Mhm. Mhm.
but if we had more time, Greg, I'd love to ask you more about Vietnam, and especially Johnson's. At times seems to be seems like there's some indecision in Johnson's own mind about what we're trying to do in Vietnam. Are we trying to win a military campaign for the purposes of combating communism or containing the spread of communism, or are we trying to civilize the Vietnamese people by helping them advance technologically and
Mhm.
agriculturally and so on and so forth? But
Well, he's indecisive the whole time.
yeah,
64 forward, which is part of the problem. And then they don't think through the long-term repercussions of the strategy they employ, which
yeah,
is natural in terms of short-term thinking for policymakers in a democracy.
very well put.
Yeah.
Very well put. So maybe that'll be a topic for another conversation in the future, Greg. I'm sure. So, hey, thank you both for being here this morning. We've come to
Thank
the
you.
end of the time, and I don't want to
Thank you,
keep
Chris.
any longer than necessary. But again, thanks very much. Very thoughtful conversation. Thanks for some great questions that prompted our conversation along. Just a quick reminder again about the email that you'll receive with the link for your certificate of participation. Um, our next Saturday webinar will be on the election of 1932, FDR versus Hoover. That's March 2nd, and I will be joined by Joe Postel of the University of Colorado at Colorado Springs and John Moser, a colleague of mine here at Ashland University and a friend of ours as well, Greg and Jason. So until then, take care and look forward to our next conversation on March 2nd. See you then. Thanks.